Today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about Mendel's peas. Now, we will discuss other types of inheritance. Now, we're going to talk about who Mendel was, because Mendel was a person. There was a we're going to talk about, well, why were his peas significant? Why did, when we talk about his peas, what do we mean? And then what we'll do is what we'll do after that is we'll spend some time just answering some questions. So, and that's gonna, yeah, that should be today's lesson. It's gonna be, we're running low on time because it's taking me a little bit to get started today. So I'll try and finish by 10:36 anyway. Let's go back a second to talk about what we talked about last time. Last time we talked about these ideas of inheritance. Inheritance is something you get from your parents. They're the genetics that you get from your parents. Your parents will give you something called a genotype. And a genotype is the specific types of genes that you will get. That genotype can, with the environment that you're in, will lead to a phenotype, which is something that you can see. That might be your skin color, your height, your weight. We talked about how something like, for example, weight is governed by both your genotype, so like what type of genes you've got, but also by your environment, how you eat, what you how much you exercise, where you live in the world, what you eat, those kinds of things. So when we talk about these, expressions of a gene, I want you guys to remember is like not all these expressions of genes necessarily mean, oh, it has to be, not all these expressions of genes have to be just genes. They could be also the environment playing a factor. Then we started to talk about this concept here. We said that you get half the DNA from your mom, half your DNA from your dad. In your genes, you will have traits. And you'll have like particular genes that will code for particular traits. And each of these traits, each of these types of traits is called like an allele. So black, blonde, brunette hair, curly, straight, they're different alleles of the same gene, different versions of the same gene. And I use the word flavor, which is not the right word, but I like it because it gives you guys an idea. Every gene can have multiple flavors. Sometimes there are only 2 flavors, like dark chocolate, milk chocolate, or white chocolate, 3 flavors. Sometimes when you got ice cream, there are, hundreds of flavors. So different times, different genes, there'll be different types of them. And then we started to talk about, well, then how do we choose? Some genes are dominant, which means, as we just talked about, that they will, if you have a dominant gene, then that's what you will show. If you have the detached earlobe gene, then your earlobes will be detached. But you can have an attached earlobe, and we would refer to that as a recessive gene. Now, a recessive gene, we talked about that here. A recessive gene or a recessive trait means that it's only expressed in no other alleles that are recessive. So the only way for you to just describe a recessive is if both of them are recessive. You guys came along the idea of what the recessive traits are weak. I guess they are weak in that they don't dominate, but they get dominated by the other dominant trait, which is like an alpha male trait. If there is an alpha male, they will dominate. But if there's no alpha males, the recessive traits will come out. The recessive traits will take over. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that dominant traits are better just because they're, they usually take over. It doesn't mean that it's good. You might have a dominant trait that we might have a recessive trait that allows us to breathe underwater, but we just never gets expressed because we always got the dominant trait. Dominant traits don't have to be good. And yeah, they also don't have to be the most common in the population. Again, if you go to somewhere like, if you go to somewhere like, I think it's like Germany, there are a lot of blonde people. Blonde is actually a recessive trait. Because there's so many blonde people, there aren't many dominant brown hair people to affect that. Let's keep going. So we talked about how we can talk about these 2 types of things. dominant trait, we're going to call, and we've got dominant trait, and then we've got dominant trait, recessive, and then recessive, recessive. And one of the things we talked about is these two are called homozygous, which is pure breeding. We're going to talk about that a little bit more today. And we talked about a heterozygous, so this one here is called a hybrid. It's a combination of both. And then we spent the last little bit talking about these are called pedigrees or family trees, or we can work out how did the dad get to this level. We did the same thing with my family and my wife's family, just because we thought, why not? And then we also, at the very end of this lesson, we talked about right-handed versus left-handed sort of things and stuff like that. Now, I asked you guys for homework and I haven't actually checked the homework yet, so I'm going to do that maybe at lunchtime. But I asked you for homework just to compare yourself against one or two of your family members, maybe even more, and just to sort of see, do you guys have traits that you share in common? Also, maybe do it with a friend or two. Do you have traits you have in common? Do you have traits that are different, you know, and looking at some of these genetic traits. What we're going to talk about today is Mendel's peas. Now, Mendel essentially, and this is talking about other types of inheritance. When we talk about Mendel, this is Gregor Mendel. He was born 1822 and died in 1884, so, you know, pretty much lived through a lot of the 1800s or 19th century. He was a monk. This picture, there's a couple of pictures that I could have taken. You could say he was a scientist, but I like saying he was a monk. And he loves gardening. And what he would used to do is he would go through his experiments in the monastery garden, and through his experiments in the monastery garden, he was able to discover dominant and recessive traits. He didn't necessarily refer to them as dominant and recessive traits, but that's what he sort of discovered. We know because of him, the combination of genes, dominant and recessive, is known as a genotype. And how it displays is a phenotype. Now, of course, he didn't use these words. He used different words, but that's what he sort of discovered. I'm going to give you guys a second to maybe copy this down, but then I'm going to share with you guys something. I want to show you one of the videos that is on style, because I thought it was a really good video that described this. I also chose this picture because I like how he's wearing a cross, because again, the whole big thing is like he was I think he was a friar. I don't think he was a monk, but yeah, he was very much like religious. Like he wasn't what you would call, as people refer to him as a scientist. It's kind of interesting that he would be known as a scientist. I'm going to show you a video now. If you haven't got this copied down, I don't want this copied down. I just want this last sentence copied down. If you were writing this down, it's too late. Don't worry about it. I just want this bottom bit. In the meantime, though, I'm going to show you guys a video first. We can come back to this in a little bit. So hold your horses. Just give me a sec. Okay, back to here. Oh, still waiting on two people to do their attendance. I want to show you guys. It was a video that was on one of the style. I'm going to set this one later on as homework, but I'm probably going to do that maybe for the second lesson today. But first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this pea experiment.
Wait, Mr. Guerrero.
Yes.
Are we talking about blood groups?
We will in a second. Why?
Because I just see that tab, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know. But we're getting up to that. Trust me. It's what we're going to do in a little bit. This only goes for a minute, so it's pretty good.
These days, scientists know how you inherit characteristics from your parents. They're able to calculate probabilities of having a specific trait or getting a genetic disease according to the information they have from the parent and the family history. But how is this possible? To understand how traits pass from one living being to its descendants, we need to go back in time to the 19th century and a man named Gregor Mendel. Mendel was an Austrian monk and biologist who loved to work with plants. By breeding the pea plants he was growing in the monastery's garden, he discovered the principles that rule heredity. In one of the most classic examples, Mendel combined a purebred yellow-seeded plant with a purebred green-seeded plant, and he got only yellow seeds.
I want to talk about for a second, hopefully you guys are watching this, what does he mean by purebred? So when he talks about purebred, and I'm going to talk about this in a couple of slides, we're talking about a green pea seed that has come from its parents were green pea seeds, its parents were green pea seeds. It's been growing in a garden for green pea seeds. At this point, there is no hidden recessive genes, whatever. They were pure bred green seeds and pure bred yellow pea seeds. So there is no other green peas whatsoever. So when you take these purebreds, what comes out?
He called the yellow color trait the dominant one because it was expressed in all the new seeds. Then he let the new yellow-seeded hybrid plant self-fertilize, and in this second generation he got both yellow and green seeds, which meant that the green trait had been hidden by the dominant yellow. He called this hidden trait the recessive trait. From those results, Mendel inferred that each trait depends on a pair of factors, one of them coming from the mother and the other from the father. Now we know that these factors are called alleles and represent the different variations of the gene. Depending on which type of allele Mendel found in each seed, we can have what we call a homozygous seed, where both alleles are identical, and what we call a heterozygous seed, when the two alleles are different. This combination of alleles is known as genotype, and its result, being yellow or green, is called phenotype.
That's one of my favorite parts, this last sentence. And I actually pretty much just stole that sentence and put it in the slideshow because it's a really good, that's sort of what I think he did. So what he, and like, I like how that's what heterozygous means. So he didn't really discover genes, and he didn't really discover dominant, like this is, DNA being manipulated. All he discovered was, hey, I've noticed that if you take a purebred and a purebred, then you can get a mixture. But if you take two mixtures together, two hybrids together, you can get some weird results. Sometimes you'll get this, hidden trait come out again, and sometimes you just get the same trait keep repeating itself. So that's sort of what he came up with. And this is sort of the idea of recessive genes. And that's another way to get to refer to them, is like a recessive gene is like a hidden trait. You don't see it. It's just sort of in the background. Some other observations that Mendel made, and I've put these here, is Mendel often referred to plants as, and this is what I just said before, I told you I'll talk about this, as purebred. And that is when the same plant, after bred with itself for several generations, has the same trait. This is homozygous, which means, again, homozygous, which means pure breeding. It's just the same thing. You take green beans, you take green peas, you make more green peas, you make more green peas. After a while, that's all there will be is green peas. There will be no recessive traits hidden in there. If you breed them for like maybe 4 or 5 generations of just green peas. A hybrid, when he bred two pure breed plants together, he made a hybrid. This is a heterozygous, a heterogeneous, which is a Y, uppercase Y, lowercase y. So homozygous, heterogeneous. No, I think I got that wrong. Heterozygous. I got that wrong. Sure. So here were some other observations that he sort of looked at. And what he was able to do is was able to construct a list of dominant traits and recessive ones. So he was able to find that, like the stem length was a dominant trait, whereas the curved one was recessive. He found that the color, yellow was dominant, but green was recessive. He found that having pure round peas was dominant, whereas having wrinkled ones was a recessive trait. And he found that having gray seed coatings was dominant, whereas white ones were recessive. Pod texture, pod color, even flower position. Now, you might look at some of these dominant ones and think, well, okay, these dominant traits, being a tall plant is better. And so it would make sense why some of these traits might be passed on more readily, but some of these recessive traits are still good. If I look at the bottom one, flowers at the top of stems, I think that's a good trait to have, is to have, and so therefore I think it would be advantageous to have that trait. But yeah, so I guess the idea is dominant traits, again, I keep saying this over and over again, so I want you guys to understand that dominant traits don't necessarily mean better. It just means dominant traits are the trait that always shows up. You can, and later on what we'll discover is, like when we talk about breeding, that's exactly what you can do. If you discover that you really like a particular color, let's just say you really like green peas, you can get green peas and breed them with other green peas, and so on and so forth. And that's how we get selective breeding, and that's how we can, you know, get certain types of organisms. One of the classic examples that I love to talk about with this is carrots. And now I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but I don't care. Carrots, the original form of carrots were purple. You guys might see sometimes in the shop purple carrots. And you're like, okay, that's a bit weird. All carrots were purple, and they're not only were they purple, they were also really small. So, like, it was just very, you know, and that's what we knew as carrots. And what we would do is that, you know, you might get a recessive trait that made a slightly less purple carrot. And so then what you would do is you would maybe take that less purple carrot and you would then breed that one with other carrots. And then you would get an even, you might end up with a orange carrot, and then that orange carrot might be, you might breed that to be a lot larger. And that's how we get pretty much all carrots that we have today, is because we've carefully made sure that we've bred certain carrots together. Now, orange carrots are probably a recessive trait, but we've bred them so that all carrots are orange. They're purebred now, so the carrots are orange. We did the same thing with broccoli. We did the same thing with cauliflower. Those two things never existed in the real world. And most of the plants that you see, if you look at, like, I think it was a banana. Bananas used to be really small little fruits, and now we've grown them. We've enhanced these genetics in them by breeding them with other big fruit to make these fruit bigger and bigger and bigger. Even dogs, yeah, dogs are the same. You know, you think that, did you guys think that naturally sausage dogs were a natural sort of thing? No, sausage dogs are not a natural thing. Like, we bred dogs to be longer and longer and longer, and that's how we end up with sausage dogs. So selective breeding, or breeding certain things to get certain traits, is something that we've been doing, and it's a way that we've been manipulating genetics even before we understood what genetics were. We've been manipulating genetics as a human species way before we even we've been manipulating genetics as a species way before we even understood what DNA was, just because we've been breeding certain things with certain things. Now, I'm going to jump ahead to this next idea. Sorry, is that a question? Yeah. You have to speak up because I can't hear you very well, sorry.
What color is the carrot?
Well, the carrot is now orange, but like originally it was purple, and you can still buy purple carrots in the supermarket if you look.
Is it rare?
I don't know about carrots.
They weren't rare at the start. Obviously, they were everywhere, but now what they've done is they're bred. They're sometimes a bit hard to find, but you can still buy carrot. Corn is another one. Corn used to be red and very, very small, and now because we've bred it,
Ew.
we made it really, really big, and it's also we've decided that yellow is a better color for corn, so we've bred it to be yellow. And so yeah, and like people still breed things. I think like the tangerine is a breed of mandarin mixed with orange. I'm not too sure about that, but we still try new fruit by breeding different fruit together. It's a kind of cool thing. It's something worth looking into. I'm going to jump ahead now. I have never tried a purple carrot though, but I hope it's good. Another way you can look at, if you can't see this, don't stress yourself out. Another way we can look at hybrids is hybrids can sometimes be called carriers. This is because they don't express their recessive gene, right? But they carry it and pass it on to other generations. So color blindness is an example of this. My example for this always comes to the fact that and this is, you guys might have your own examples, but my grandfather was colorblind. Now, my mother was not colorblind. She could see everything, but she still had the colorblind gene, and so she was a carrier of color blindness. And what that meant was that when my brother then became colorblind. So my mum, in that way, passed on the color blindness onto my brother. Now, I'm not colorblind. The reason that I'm not colorblind is that for lucky reasons for me, I didn't get the color blindness gene from my mother. My sister is not colorblind, but she still might have the color blindness gene. We won't know until she one day has kids. But yeah, that's what we refer to as a carrier. They carry genes from one generation to the next generation.
Okay, so what color is number 12?
I can
what
see
color is number 12?
I can see number 12. It's all that whether you can or can't see the number. It's always worth
What color is it?
What color
orange.
is it?
It's orange? Oh
Yes.
shit, okay.
Okay.
It's all about I can see it. Like wouldn't pick one. My brother's got, I think from memory, my brother's got a mug that says some swear word on it, and he carries it around with him all the time. And he goes, well, I can't see anything. It's just a bunch of dots. But he knows that it says screw you or something on it. I can't remember. It might be a t-shirt, but I remember when he told me about it. It was funny. Anyway, finishing up, I want to talk about, I guess I'll start talking about this and I'll finish talking about it next period because I get a little bit more time. Blood groups, I'll talk about blood groups next, but I'll talk about this now. Other types of inheritance. Now, this is the whole point of the lesson. So I'll talk about, and by the way, guys, I'm going to set up a different Zoom meeting next time. So we have been discussing dominance and recessive. But so far as we've been focused on something called complete dominance. The next two things I'm going to talk to you guys about something called partial dominance. Now, what partial dominance means is that unlike in complete dominance, where it's either a green pea or a yellow pea, or where in complete dominance, whether you're brown, where the complete dominance, whether you've got an earlobe attached or an earlobe not attached. Partial dominance, this is when genes are both dominant. This is when genes are, there are two types of partial dominance. We're going to talk about the first one now, and the second one we'll do period 6. First one's called incomplete dominance. This is where when genes are both dominant, So when a hybrid, a heterozygous, meaning both, organism is made, is a mixture of the phenotypes. I guess this is the key word here, mixture. So if you look here, see we've got RR, dominant red, and here we've got WW, dominant white, dominant white. When you breed these together, you will get red-white dominance. And red-white dominance actually makes something that's pink. It's not, the red one doesn't take over the white one. The red one doesn't dominate over the white one. The white one doesn't dominate over the red one. Instead, the phenotype what you see, remember phenotype means what you physically see is pink. Okay? And that's the same for all of these. Now, what's interesting though is you take a red white and you breed it with a red white, they could get a couple of different genes. They could both get red genes, in which case they become red, and they are pure red. They could both get white genes, in which case they would go white, you know, and that means that they are pure white. Or they could get a red and a white, which would make them pink again. The idea is, hold on, someone, yeah. The idea of this is, all right, this. The idea of this is, and I'm going to wrap up here because I know the lesson's about to end. The idea that I'm trying to say here is that with incomplete dominance, you get a mixture of the dominant genes. You get a red and a white will mix. If you have a tall and a short person, then you get an average sized person. And this is sort of where a little bit got to do with eye color comes from. If you take a blue and a brown, you might get a mixture. So you might get a bluey brown color. You know, if you get, if you have black hair and blonde hair, and you mix them together, you might get black hair or blonde hair, but you might get a mixture. It might be a brown. That's what we refer to as incomplete dominance. Some genes are just complete dominance, either one way or the other. But this incomplete dominance is where you get like a little bit of a mixture. And
Ding
so,
ding, it's time to leave, sir.
yeah, I know, Talik, don't worry, I said this is the last bit. What I'm going to talk about period 6 is I'm going to talk about the other type of dominance, which is called codominance. And that's going to be next, and that's going to be period 6. So I'm going to see you guys a little bit later about 2 o'clock, and we'll go through that last, 2:20, we'll go through that last thing.